She thought he married her for revenge, until she found his hidden letters. Sometimes the cruelest twist of fate comes disguised as salvation. Today I'm sharing a story that will challenge everything you think you know about love, revenge, and the lengths one man will go to protect the woman he's secretly adored for years. This is a tale of hidden letters, dangerous conspiracies, and a love so deep that it masqueraded as hatred for 3 long years. Meet Sophia Harrington, a 24-year-old woman whose world shattered in a single devastating week. Her father, Marcus Harrington, had built a successful shipping empire from nothing, starting with a single vessel when Sophia was just a child and growing it into one of England's most respected maritime businesses. The Harrington name had become synonymous with integrity and fair dealing, providing luxury and security for their family. Sophia had grown up in their grand estate in Surrey, educated by the finest tutors, fluent in 3 languages and well-versed in literature, music and art. She was known throughout London society for her intelligence, her kindness to those less fortunate, and her striking beauty with auburn hair and emerald eyes that seemed to see straight into people's souls. But when a financial scandal erupted, revealing what appeared to be embezzlement and fraud within Marcus's company, everything they'd worked for crumbled overnight. The newspapers painted Marcus as a master manipulator who had been stealing from investors for years, using their money to fund a lavish lifestyle while his ships carried illegal cargo across international waters. Bank accounts were frozen, assets were seized, and within days the Harrington name became synonymous with disgrace and betrayal. Sophia watched in horror as her father aged 10 years in a single week, his proud shoulders slumping under the weight of accusations he swore were false. But this wasn't just bad luck or poor business decisions gone wrong. Behind the scandal stood one of the most powerful families in England, the Blackwoods. Led by the formidable Duke Alexander Blackwood, they controlled vast shipping routes across the Atlantic and Mediterranean, had political connections that reached into Parliament itself, and possessed the financial resources to destroy anyone who threatened their dominance. The Blackwood family had ruled the shipping industry for over 2 centuries, and they didn't tolerate competition or interference. At 28, Alexander was known throughout London society for his jet-black hair that caught the light like raven's wings, piercing dark eyes that seemed to see through any deception, and a reputation for ruthless business dealings that left his competitors either bankrupt or begging for mercy. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored coats and a presence that commanded attention the moment he entered any room. Those who crossed him rarely recovered, and those who tried to challenge the Blackwood Empire found themselves facing not just financial ruin, but complete social destruction. The morning after her father's arrest, as Sophia sat in their breakfast room surrounded by newspapers bearing headlines that destroyed her family's reputation, she received a letter that would change her life forever. The envelope bore the Blackwood family seal, a raven clutching a ship's anchor, and inside, written in bold, decisive handwriting, was an offer that made her blood run cold. Alexander Blackwood was offering a solution to her family's ruin, but at a price that seemed more cruel than mercy. He would personally clear her father's debts, which had mounted to over £50,000, restore the family's reputation through his own considerable influence, and ensure Marcus avoided the 20-year prison sentence that awaited him. The evidence against Marcus would mysteriously disappear, key witnesses would recant their testimony, and the Harrington shipping licenses would be renewed. In exchange for this salvation, Sophia would become Alexander's wife within the month, bound to him by law and unable to ever escape the arrangement. "It's not a request," Sophia whispered as she read the letter aloud to her devastated mother, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "It's an ultimatum wrapped in the guise of generosity." Her mother, Elena, broke down in tears for the 3rd time that morning. "He wants to humiliate us completely. Taking you as his bride is the final revenge against our family. You'll be trapped with a man who despises everything we represent, forced to bear his children and smile while he destroys what little dignity we have left." But as Sophia read and reread the letter, she realized she had no choice. The alternative was watching her father spend the rest of his life in prison for crimes she believed he hadn't committed, seeing her mother lose their home and live in poverty, and knowing that their family name would be forever stained with scandal. At least if she agreed to Alexander's terms, her parents would be safe and their reputation restored, even if it cost her any chance of happiness or true love. The negotiation process was handled through lawyers, cold and impersonal as a business transaction. Alexander's terms were specific and non-negotiable. The wedding would take place in 1 month, giving Sophia exactly 30 days to prepare for a life she had never wanted. She would live at his estate, Ravenshollow, and be expected to fulfill all the duties of a duchess, including attending social functions and representing the Blackwood family with grace and dignity. In return, her father would be completely exonerated, their debts cleared, and the Harrington shipping business quietly absorbed into the Blackwood Empire without any appearance of a hostile takeover. During those 30 days of preparation, Sophia tried to learn everything she could about the man who would become her husband. What she discovered only deepened her dread. Alexander was known for his intelligence and strategic thinking, but also for his complete emotional detachment. He had never been seriously involved with any woman, despite being one of England's most eligible bachelors. He worked 18 hours a day, managed his business empire with an iron fist, and was respected but never loved by those who served him. Society whispered that he was incapable of genuine human connection, that his heart was as cold as the stone walls of his ancestral estate. The wedding was arranged with military precision, cold, calculated, and designed to send a message to anyone who dared challenge the Blackwood Empire. The ceremony took place at St. Margaret's Church in Westminster, with over 300 guests from the highest levels of society. Sophia wore her grandmother's ivory silk gown, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried white roses that reminded her of funeral flowers. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she could feel the eyes of every guest upon her, some filled with pity, others with curiosity about this unusual alliance. On her wedding day, as Sophia stood before Alexander at the altar of his private estate chapel for the blessing ceremony following the formal church wedding, she saw no warmth in his dark eyes. His expression was stone cold as he spoke the additional vows that would bind them together in the eyes of his family traditions. He looked magnificent in his black formal wear, but there was something almost predatory in the way he watched her, as if she were a prize he had won rather than a woman he was choosing to love. When he lifted her veil for the traditional kiss, he paused for a moment that stretched into eternity and whispered words that confirmed her worst fears. "This is only the beginning of what your family owes mine, and I intend to collect every debt in full." The kiss that followed was brief and cold, a claiming rather than a celebration, and Sophia felt her heart turn to ice as she realized the full scope of the prison she had entered. What Sophia didn't know was that this marriage was part of a much deeper game, one that had been set in motion years before their family's public conflict began, rooted in secrets and emotions that Alexander had buried so deeply that even he sometimes forgot they existed. Life as the Duchess of Blackwood was a beautiful prison wrapped in luxury and privilege. Alexander's estate, Ravenshollow, was magnificent beyond anything Sophia had ever imagined. Sprawling grounds that stretched for miles in every direction, ancient oak trees that had stood for centuries, formal gardens designed by the most celebrated landscapers in Europe, and a manor house that had housed dukes for over 400 years. The house itself contained over 60 rooms, including a library with first-edition volumes dating back to Shakespeare's time, a ballroom with crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna, and art collections that museums would envy. But for Sophia, all this grandeur felt like a gilded cage designed to remind her of her powerlessness. She had her own suite of rooms in the East Wing, decorated in pale blues and gold that should have been beautiful but felt cold and impersonal. Her days were structured around the duties expected of a duchess, managing the household staff, planning social events, visiting tenants on the estate, and maintaining correspondence with other noble families. She attended charity luncheons where women spoke in whispers about her unusual marriage, hosted dinner parties where guests treated her with polite deference tinged with curiosity, and smiled until her face ached while playing the role of the perfect noble wife. Alexander kept his distance with the precision of a master strategist, speaking to her only when necessary and treating her with the cold politeness reserved for unwelcome guests who couldn't be dismissed. He worked late into the night in his private study, traveled frequently for business to London, Liverpool, and sometimes as far as India or the Americas, and when they did share meals, the silence between them was deafening. Their conversations were limited to practical matters, upcoming social obligations, household expenses, or messages from her family. He never asked about her thoughts, her feelings, or her adjustment to life as his wife. To the outside world, they appeared to be a powerful couple perfectly suited to each other. Alexander would escort her to the opera, where they sat in the Blackwood family box and nodded politely at other attendees. He danced with her at balls with technical perfection but no warmth, his hand on her waist feeling more like a restraint than a caress. When they attended state functions or business dinners, He introduced her with pride in his voice that she knew was entirely for show, and she played her part flawlessly, smiling and charming guests while dying a little inside with each performance. But behind closed doors, Sophia felt like she was slowly disappearing, her true self withering under the weight of pretense and isolation. She missed her parents desperately, though Alexander allowed her to visit them only once a month under his careful supervision. She missed her friends, most of whom had distanced themselves either from fear of the Blackwood influence or from discomfort with her situation. Most of all, she missed the hope she had once carried for a future filled with love, laughter, and genuine partnership with someone who would see and value her true self. 3 months into their marriage, during one of Alexander's business trips to negotiate new shipping contracts in Portsmouth, Sophia found herself wandering the forbidden east wing of the manor. She'd been told by the head butler, Stevens, that this section contained only old storage rooms, family archives, and quarters for visiting servants, but her curiosity had been building for weeks. The wing felt different from the rest of the house, quieter, older, with portraits of long-dead Blackwoods watching from shadowed walls, and an atmosphere of secrets that seemed to whisper from every corner. As she explored the dusty corridors, running her fingers along oak-paneled walls that had witnessed centuries of family history, she discovered something unexpected, a private study that was clearly in regular use despite being tucked away from the main house. The door was partially open, and late afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a room that was unmistakably Alexander's private sanctuary. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany desk that must have been crafted by master woodworkers, its surface covered with business documents, shipping manifests, and correspondence bearing seals from companies across Europe. Maps of shipping routes were pinned to one wall, marked with notations in Alexander's precise handwriting. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled not just with business texts but with volumes of poetry, philosophy, and classic literature that suggested a mind far more complex than the cold businessman he presented to the world. But what caught her attention and made her heart race with nervous excitement was a locked drawer in the desk that had been left slightly ajar, as if someone had been interrupted while closing it. Through the gap, she could see papers that looked different from the usual business correspondence, personal letters written on fine stationery in Alexander's distinctive handwriting. Her conscience told her to leave, to respect his privacy and return to her own quarters, but the desperate need to understand the man she had married overcame her moral reservations. Inside the drawer, she found something that changed everything she thought she knew about their relationship: dozens of letters written in Alexander's hand, all addressed to someone identified only as S. The papers were organized chronologically, some dating back over 3 years, and all bearing signs of having been written and rewritten multiple times, with corrections and crossed-out words that spoke of deep emotional investment. Her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation, Sophia opened the first letter, dated 3 years and 2 months earlier, and began to read words that shattered everything she believed about Alexander's motives. "My dearest S, I saw you at the summer charity gala tonight, and I find myself unable to think of anything else. You wore that blue dress with the silver embroidery that brings out the green in your eyes, and when you laughed at something Lady Catherine said about her husband's latest political blunder, I felt my resolve weakening like sand before the tide. I know I can never approach you, not with our family's growing tension over the shipping contracts, not with father's plans that I'm only beginning to understand, but watching you from across the room, graceful and kind to everyone you spoke with, I couldn't help but imagine a different world where circumstances didn't stand between us, where I could cross that room and ask you to dance without causing a scandal that would destroy both our families." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The letter was about her. She remembered that gala, remembered the blue dress, remembered laughing with Lady Catherine about her husband's attempts to understand maritime law. Alexander had been there, but she'd barely noticed him among the crowd of eligible bachelors her mother had pointed out throughout the evening. She had no idea he'd been watching her, thinking about her, struggling with feelings he couldn't express. But as she read deeper into the collection, the picture became even more complex and troubling. A letter from 2 years ago revealed something that made her blood run cold. The Pemberton family is getting closer to the truth about father's dealings with the French shipping consortium. If they succeed in exposing the illegal contracts, it won't just destroy our family's reputation, it will put you in direct danger. Thomas Pemberton has already made threats about making the Harringtons pay for interfering with his investigation. He knows your father stumbled upon evidence during that cargo inspection last month, and he's convinced that Marcus will turn it over to the authorities. I need to find a way to protect you, even if it means you'll hate me for it, even if it means destroying any chance we might have had for happiness together. Sophia's mind raced as she tried to process this information. She knew about her father's investigation into cargo irregularities. He'd mentioned discovering shipping manifests that didn't match actual cargo loads, payments that couldn't be traced to legitimate sources, and vessels that seemed to disappear for weeks at a time with no official record of their destinations. But she hadn't realized that his investigation had uncovered evidence of a much larger conspiracy, or that it had put their entire family in danger. As she continued reading, the scope of the conspiracy became clearer. The Pembertons, a rival shipping family with connections throughout Europe, had been the real orchestrators of her father's downfall. They had been using their shipping network to smuggle weapons to various political factions across the continent, making enormous profits from the conflicts that were brewing in several European nations. When Marcus Harrington's investigation threatened to expose their operation, they had decided to destroy his credibility by framing him for the very crimes they were committing. But the most shocking revelation came in a letter dated just 1 month before their wedding, written in handwriting that seemed more urgent and emotional than the others. Tomorrow I will ask for your hand in marriage, knowing you will see it as the cruelest revenge imaginable. The truth is, I've loved you since we were teenagers, since that summer when you helped me when I was thrown from my horse during the fox hunt at Bramblewood Estate. You probably don't even remember, you were only 16, I was 19 and too proud to properly thank you, but your kindness to a stranger changed everything for me. You didn't care that I was a duke's son or that helping me might ruin your dress. You just saw someone who needed help and gave it freely, with a smile that lit up your entire face. This marriage is the only way I can keep you safe from Thomas Pemberton's threats while giving your family the protection they desperately need. The evidence against your father is fabricated, but it's sophisticated enough that proving his innocence could take years, years he doesn't have, and years that would leave you vulnerable to Pemberton's revenge. By making you my wife, I give you the full protection of the Blackwood name and resources, and I can work to destroy Pemberton's operation from within the shipping industry. I pray that someday you'll understand my motives, even if you never forgive me for the deception. I pray that the coldness I'll be forced to show you won't destroy the warmth I've seen in your eyes. And I pray that when this is all over, when Pemberton is defeated and your father's name is cleared, there might be a chance for truth between us. I know I have no right to hope for your love after what I'm about to do, but I cannot stop myself from hoping nonetheless. Sophia dropped the letter as if it had burned her fingers, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd just read. She did remember that summer day at Bramblewood Estate. She'd been attending a house party with her parents, and during the fox hunt, a young man with dark hair had been thrown violently from his horse when it stumbled in a rabbit hole. While other guests watched in shock or rode past, Sophia had immediately dismounted and rushed to help him, using her riding skirt to cushion his head and checking him for serious injuries despite the protests of her maid about propriety. The young man had been dazed from the fall, his left arm clearly broken, but he'd insisted he was fine and tried to wave away her assistance. Sophia had ignored his protests, helping him to a nearby tree for support and sending another rider for medical help. She'd stayed with him for over an hour, talking to keep him conscious and alert, sharing stories about her favorite books and asking about his interests to keep his mind off the pain. When help finally arrived, he tried to thank her properly, but she'd brushed off his gratitude, saying that anyone would have done the same thing. She'd never realized that the injured young man was Alexander Blackwood. She'd left the house party the next day and hadn't given the incident much thought, beyond hoping that he'd recovered fully from his injuries. To discover now that this moment of simple human kindness had had such a profound impact on him, that he'd been carrying feelings for her for all these years while she remained completely unaware, left her feeling shaken and confused. As she sat in his private study, surrounded by years of secret correspondence that revealed his true feelings, Sophia heard footsteps echoing in the corridor outside. Alexander was returning early from his trip to Portsmouth, and she was about to be caught in his most private sanctuary with his deepest secrets scattered around her like evidence of a crime. Quickly, she tried to gather the letters and return them to the drawer, but she wasn't fast enough. The footsteps paused outside the study door, and she heard Alexander's voice speaking to someone, probably Stevens, giving instructions about his luggage or asking about household matters during his absence. She had perhaps 30 seconds before he would enter the room and find her there with his private correspondence. Sophia, Alexander's voice was deadly quiet as he found her in his study, letters scattered around her on the Persian carpet like fallen leaves. His dark eyes took in the scene with the sharp intelligence that made him such a formidable businessman, and for the first time since their wedding she saw raw emotion cross his face, not anger as she'd expected, but something closer to fear and vulnerability. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, still wearing his traveling coat and gloves, dust from the road on his boots, and she could see him struggling to regain the composure that was his constant armor. His jaw was tense, his hands clenched at his sides, and she realized that for all his power and control, this moment terrified him more than any business negotiation or political maneuvering ever could. "How long have you been reading those?" he asked finally, moving slowly into the room as if approaching a wounded animal that might flee at any sudden movement. "Long enough," Sophia whispered, holding up the letter about the riding accident with shaking hands. "Long enough to know that everything I believed about our marriage, about your motives, about you, was a lie." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, and she watched his carefully constructed facade finally crack like ice under pressure. When he opened them again, she saw exhaustion, regret, and something that looked almost like relief. "You weren't supposed to find those," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You weren't supposed to know any of it." "Why?" The word came out as a broken sob that surprised them both with its intensity. "Why let me believe you hated me? Why let me think this was all revenge? Why let me suffer for months thinking I was trapped with a man who despised everything about me?" Alexander ran his hands through his black hair, a gesture she'd never seen from him before. It made him look younger, more human, less like the untouchable duke and more like the vulnerable young man who had once needed her help. "Because if you knew the truth, you would have tried to protect me instead of letting me protect you. You would have insisted on facing Pemberton yourself, or convinced your father to testify against him despite the danger. You've always been too brave for your own good, too willing to sacrifice yourself for others." "So you decided to sacrifice yourself instead?" Sophia asked, standing up from where she'd been kneeling on the floor. "You decided to let me hate you so that I would be safe?" "Yes," Alexander said simply, "and I would do it again because keeping you safe is worth any personal cost to me." Before either of them could say more, a commotion erupted from the front of the house that shattered the intimate tension of their conversation. Shouting voices carried through the windows, the sound of horses being ridden hard up the main drive, and then the unmistakable crash of the front door being forced open with violence that echoed through the entire manor. Alexander's expression hardened instantly, all vulnerability disappearing as his protective instincts took over. He moved to his desk with swift efficiency, pulling out a pistol that Sophia hadn't known was there and checking to ensure it was loaded. "Get behind the desk and stay down," he commanded, but even as the words left his mouth, they both realized it was too late for hiding. Thomas Pemberton strode into the study flanked by 3 armed men, his presence filling the room like a toxic cloud. He was a heavyset man in his 50s with cold grey eyes, thinning hair, and a cruel smile that made Sophia's skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. His expensive clothes couldn't disguise the brutality that emanated from him, and she understood immediately why Alexander had been so desperate to protect her from this man's attention. "Well, well," Thomas said, his voice cultured but with an underlying menace that made every word sound like a threat. "The happy couple, having a domestic dispute, how wonderfully dramatic. I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Pemberton," Alexander stepped protectively in front of Sophia, the pistol held steadily in his right hand. "You're trespassing on private property, and you've brought armed men into my home. I suggest you leave before this situation escalates beyond your ability to control it." "Trespassing?" Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "My dear Blackwood, I prefer to think of it as collecting a debt. You see, your little protective scheme has failed spectacularly. I know about the evidence Marcus Harrington found about my shipping operations, and I know you've hidden both the evidence and the man's daughter, but your charade ends today." Thomas gestured to one of his men, a scarred individual who produced a thick legal document from his coat. "I've had my lawyers working overtime, calling in favors from judges and magistrates across England. It turns out that if anything unfortunate happens to you, your estate, including your wife, reverts to Crown management pending investigation of your family's business dealings, and I have certain arrangements with the Crown's representatives that will ensure a favorable outcome for my interests." Sophia felt Alexander tense beside her like a coiled spring, and she realized that Thomas had found the one legal loophole that could circumvent the protection Alexander had tried to provide. If Alexander died, she would be left completely vulnerable, with no legal recourse and no family connections powerful enough to protect her from whatever revenge Thomas planned. What exactly do you want, Pemberton? Alexander's voice was dangerously low, but Sophia could hear the calculation behind it. He was buying time, trying to find a way out of the trap that had been so carefully constructed. Simple demands, really, Thomas replied, settling into a chair as if he were a welcome guest rather than an intruder threatening their lives. I want the evidence your father-in-law discovered about my European operations. I want Sophia's sworn testimony that she knows nothing about her father's investigation and that the Harrington scandal was entirely legitimate. I want a public statement from both of you acknowledging that the charges against Marcus were justified and that any rumors about my business practices are malicious lies. And finally, I want both of you to disappear quietly, perhaps a nice estate in the Americas where you can live out your days in comfortable exile, far from English politics and shipping concerns. And if we refuse? Alexander asked, though they all knew he was simply going through the motions of negotiation. Thomas's smile widened, showing teeth that reminded Sophia of a predator toying with trapped prey. Well, accidents happen so frequently to people who oppose me. Tragic house fires that consume entire families, carriage accidents on dangerous mountain roads, mysterious illnesses that strike without warning. The grieving widow scenario has always been popular in Gothic novels, hasn't it? A young duchess, overcome by guilt over her father's crimes, takes her own life in despair, leaving her noble husband to mourn her loss and eventually remarry someone more suitable to his station. Sophia watched in growing horror as the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. Her father hadn't just stumbled upon financial irregularities, he discovered evidence of Thomas Pemberton's involvement in illegal arms smuggling that stretched from London to Paris to Vienna, supplying weapons to revolutionary factions and political dissidents across Europe. The profits from these operations were enormous, but so were the risks if the operation was exposed to the wrong authorities. The Pembertons had orchestrated her father's financial scandal not just to discredit him personally, but to ensure that any evidence he'd found would be dismissed as the desperate lies of a convicted criminal trying to avoid punishment for his own crimes. They'd counted on the Harrington family being destroyed completely, with Marcus in prison, Elena in poverty, and Sophia left defenseless and available for whatever fate they deemed appropriate. There's one significant problem with your plan, Pemberton, Alexander said calmly, and Sophia detected something almost like satisfaction in his voice despite their dire circumstances. Oh, and what might that be? Thomas asked, leaning forward with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. Alexander reached into a different desk drawer, not the one where he kept the letters, but another that Sophia hadn't noticed before. He withdrew a thick folder of documents bound with legal ribbons, and she could see Thomas's confident expression falter for the first time since he'd entered the room. You see, I've spent the last 3 years not just protecting Sophia and her family, but gathering evidence of your entire operation, Alexander said, his voice taking on the cold authority that had made him feared throughout England's business community. Shipping manifests that don't match cargo loads, payment records that trace back to arms dealers in 6 different countries, correspondence with revolutionary factions planning to overthrow established governments, everything. Thomas's face went pale beneath his confident facade. That's impossible. We destroyed all the records of our European operations, every document, every letter, every contract. You destroyed all the records you knew about, Alexander corrected with a slight smile that held no warmth. But you forgot that my shipping company handles insurance investigations for half the vessels that pass through English waters. We've been documenting every suspicious cargo transfer, every unexplained payment discrepancy, every forged manifest that's crossed our desks. The evidence isn't just substantial, it's overwhelming, and it's already in the hands of 3 separate government officials who have standing orders to release it publicly if anything happens to me or my wife. The room fell silent except for the sound of Thomas Pemberton's heavy breathing and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. His men looked to him for orders, but for the first time since entering the house, the man who had orchestrated so much destruction looked genuinely uncertain about his next move. You're bluffing, Thomas said finally, but his voice lacked the conviction that had carried him through the earlier threats. You wouldn't risk exposing the evidence if it meant destroying your own family's shipping business in the process. Alexander's smile became genuinely predatory. Try me. I've already moved the majority of our legitimate operations to companies controlled by trusted associates. The Blackwood family has survived much worse scandals than shipping insurance fraud, but your arms-dealing operation, Your illegal weapons sales to European revolutionaries, that's treason, Pemberton, that's a hanging offense. What happened next would test everything Sophia had learned about the man she'd married, and force her to make a choice that would determine not just their survival, but whether their marriage could transform from a protective arrangement into something real and lasting. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Thomas Pemberton's eyes darted between Alexander, the documents that could condemn him, and his armed men who were beginning to shift nervously as they realized the full implications of what they'd become involved in. Sophia could see him calculating odds, weighing risks, trying to find a way out of the trap that had been 3 years in the making. The tension in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the occasional creak of the old house settling around them. Sophia found herself studying Alexander's profile as he faced down the man who had threatened everything she loved, and she saw something in his expression that she'd never noticed before, not just determination or strategic thinking, but a kind of quiet courage that came from fighting for something more important than personal safety. Finally, Thomas made his choice. He lunged for the documents on Alexander's desk, clearly intending to destroy the evidence that could condemn him, but Alexander was faster. In one fluid movement, he tackled Thomas while shouting to Sophia, "The safe behind the painting, the combination is your birthday." What followed was chaos that seemed to unfold in slow motion. Thomas's men advanced on Alexander, but they seemed uncertain about their orders. They'd been hired for intimidation, not murder, and the prospect of killing a duke in his own home was beyond what they'd agreed to when they'd taken Pemberton's money. Meanwhile, Sophia realized that this was her moment to act. Everything, her father's freedom, Alexander's life, their chance at a real future together, depended on her reaching that safe and securing whatever additional evidence Alexander had hidden there. She dove behind the painting of Alexander's family crest, a massive oil portrait of the first Duke of Blackwood, and found the hidden safe exactly where he'd indicated. Her fingers flew over the combination lock, her birthday, the date he'd somehow remembered despite all his protestations of coldness. Inside the safe, she found not just additional evidence against Thomas, but something else that made her heart race, a letter addressed to her, sealed but dated for today's date. Alexander had known this confrontation was coming and had prepared for the possibility that he might not survive it. "Stop," she shouted, holding up the contents of the safe. "It's over, Mr. Pemberton. The evidence is already copied and distributed to authorities in London, Portsmouth and Dover. But more than that," she broke the seal on the letter with shaking hands and began to read aloud the first lines. "If you are reading this, Sophia, it means I am likely dead or about to die, and I need you to know the truth about everything I've done." Even Thomas's men paused their advance to listen as she continued with growing emotion. "I manipulated your father's scandal not to destroy him, but to put him in protective custody where Pemberton couldn't reach him. The charges against him are completely false, and the evidence to prove his innocence is in this safe, along with documentation of the real crimes that Pemberton wanted to pin on him. I orchestrated our marriage not for revenge or to satisfy some family vendetta, but because it was the only way to give you the legal protection of the Blackwood name, while I gathered enough evidence to destroy the real criminals who threatened your family. If I die today, know that every decision I made was to protect you, because I have loved you since the day you bandaged my wounds and refused to let me thank you properly. You taught me that kindness doesn't require reward or recognition, and you've been the light that guided every choice I've made since that day. The coldness I showed you was the hardest role I've ever played, and if I could take back the pain I caused you, I would trade everything I own for that chance." The room fell completely silent as the full truth settled over everyone present. Thomas Pemberton's face had gone through a series of changes, from anger to desperation to a kind of hollow resignation, as he realized that his elaborate plan had not only failed but had exposed him completely. His men lowered their weapons, the fight going out of them as they understood that they were now accessories to treason rather than participants in a simple business dispute. "It's over, Thomas," Alexander said quietly, standing up from where they'd been struggling. His jacket was torn and there was a cut on his cheek from Pemberton's desperate attack, but his voice was steady and certain. "You can surrender now and face trial with whatever dignity remains to you, or you can run and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, knowing that every port, every customs house, every government official in Europe has your description and orders to arrest you on sight. But either way, your operation is finished, your threats are meaningless, and my wife is under the protection of not just the Blackwood name but the crown itself." Thomas Pemberton looked around the room one final time, at the documents that would condemn him, at his men who were already backing toward the door, at Alexander and Sophia standing together united against him. The cruelty that had defined his expression throughout the confrontation had been replaced by something closer to bewilderment, as if he couldn't quite understand how his perfect plan had unraveled so completely. "This isn't over," he said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to him, like the empty threats of a defeated man trying to maintain some facade of power. "Yes," Alexander replied with finality that brooked no argument, "it is." After Thomas and his men left under the escort of local authorities who had been alerted by Alexander's contingency plans, Sophia found herself alone with her husband in the study that had revealed so many secrets. The letters were still scattered on the floor around them like evidence of a life lived in shadows, and the afternoon sun streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate not just the room but the truth that had been hidden for so long. "The riding accident," she said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "I do remember now. You were so proud when you first fell, refusing help until you nearly collapsed from the pain. I thought you were arrogant and insufferable." Alexander smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since their wedding day, and it transformed his entire face from cold marble to warm humanity. "I was arrogant and insufferable, but you helped anyway, even after I was rude to you. You told me that sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to accept kindness from others, and that pride was a luxury I couldn't afford when I was genuinely hurt. All this time," Sophia continued, moving closer to him, "you let me believe you were my captor, my enemy, someone who had trapped me in a loveless marriage for your own twisted satisfaction." "I was afraid," Alexander admitted, and the vulnerability in his voice was something she'd never heard before. "Afraid that if you knew the truth about my feelings, you'd put yourself in danger trying to help me fight Pemberton. Afraid that if I showed you how much I cared, he would use those feelings against us both. And afraid—" He paused, the commanding presence he usually projected giving way to something much more human and uncertain. "Afraid that even after everything was over, even after the truth came out, you could never love someone who had manipulated your life so completely, even with the best of intentions." Sophia stepped closer to him, close enough to see the uncertainty in his dark eyes, close enough to touch the cut on his cheek that he'd sustained while defending them both. "You're right about one thing," she said, and watched his face fall as he braced himself for rejection. "I could never love someone who manipulated my life, someone who lied to me for months, someone who let me suffer in silence while playing elaborate games with my happiness." Alexander closed his eyes as if her words were physical blows, and she could see him preparing to accept whatever punishment she deemed appropriate for his deception. "But," she continued, reaching up to touch his face gently, "I could love someone who sacrificed his own happiness to protect mine. Someone who spent 3 years gathering evidence to save my father from prison. Someone who married me not for revenge or family honor, but to give me his name and protection when I needed it most. Someone who was willing to let me hate him if it meant keeping me safe." "Sophia," Alexander's voice was hoarse with emotion, and she could see the hope and fear warring in his expression. "The question is," she continued, her own voice growing stronger with certainty, "are you brave enough to let me love the real you? Not the cold, calculating duke you pretended to be, not the distant husband who treated me like an unwelcome obligation, but the man who writes love letters he never intends to send. The man who remembered my birthday well enough to use it as a safe combination. The man who was willing to die today rather than let Thomas Pemberton hurt me." For an answer, Alexander pulled her into his arms and kissed her, not the cold, duty-bound kiss from their wedding day, but with all the passion and tenderness of 3 years of suppressed feelings finally allowed expression. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Sophia could see tears in his eyes that matched her own. "Your father will be released tomorrow," Alexander said, his voice still unsteady with emotion. "All charges dropped, full pardon, complete restoration of his business reputation. The Pemberton evidence guarantees that, and I've already spoken with the relevant authorities to ensure the process moves quickly." "And us?" Sophia asked, her heart racing with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. Alexander smiled again, the expression lighting up his entire face and making him look younger, happier, more like the man she was beginning to understand he truly was beneath all the protective armor he'd built around himself. "Us? Well, we're already married, which saves us the trouble of a lengthy courtship. But if you'd like, we could try it again, this time for love instead of protection, this time with truth instead of deception, this time as partners choosing each other rather than prisoners trapped by circumstances." 6 months later, Sophia and Alexander renewed their vows in the same chapel where they'd first married, but everything about the ceremony was different. This time her father walked her down the aisle as a free man, vindicated and proud, his shipping business restored and thriving under partnership with the Blackwood Empire. This time when Alexander lifted her veil, his eyes were warm with love and anticipation instead of cold with duty and regret. And this time when he whispered to her during the ceremony, his words were, "This is only the beginning of our real story together, and I promise to spend every day of our marriage earning your trust and proving myself worthy of your love." The letters Alexander had written but never sent were now displayed in a frame in their bedroom, not as secrets to be hidden, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the greatest sacrifices, and that truth, however late it comes, has the power to transform everything. They served as evidence of the depth of feeling that had existed even during the darkest days of their marriage, and as a promise that they would never again let fear and pride stand between them and honest communication. Their marriage became something neither of them had dared to hope for, a true partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a love that had been tested by deception and emerged stronger for having survived it. They worked together to rebuild the shipping industry's reputation, using their combined resources to create fair labor practices and eliminate the kind of corruption that had allowed people like Thomas Pemberton to flourish. They traveled together to the far corners of the world, exploring new trade routes and building relationships with partners who shared their values. Most importantly, they learned to trust each other completely, sharing every decision, every concern, and every dream. Alexander never again made the mistake of trying to protect Sophia by keeping her in ignorance, and she proved herself to be every bit as brave and intelligent as he'd always believed her to be. Together, they created a love story that began with deception but flourished in truth, proving that sometimes the most unlikely foundations can support the strongest and most enduring partnerships. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in the power of true love to overcome even the most impossible circumstances.